Hello. Today I'm going to talk about some of the things to think about when you're receiving a delivery. Now, this is an interesting illustration of some of the ways that a project manager thinks in terms of what could go wrong, what are the details, how precise I need to be. So this is an interesting little exercise. There's a written version on my website and I'll put the link below so you can have a look and read that if you'd like to. So first of all, the obvious thing with the delivery is exactly what is being delivered and exactly when. This is really important because it's easy to be bamboozled by people leading you to believe that something different to what you're actually going to get is going to get delivered at a slightly different time than you're expecting. So I would start off by being very precise about what this delivery is actually meant to be and when it's going to be delivered, so that you have these details really nailed down. The next thing I would think about is how many boxes. You may be organising a delivery for a server or a rack or something, and you're thinking of it coming as a single piece. It may not be. It may be coming as multiple boxes, which will mean more handling and more space for storage and complicate things. So if you can find out in advance how many boxes you're expecting, that's going to make things easier for you later on. And the next thing is to check what is actually included in terms of cables, connectors and so on. So if you're expecting cables and connectors, you need to be precise about this with this. So this I'm thinking about particularly is if it's a server or something that's electronic or electrical or whatever, does it come with the leads connected to the network or other resources or telemetry tools or whatever? So check that. The next thing is also what is included within the enclosure. So if it's a server or something, which cards are actually coming with it, which chips are coming on the cards, all the details about what is actually included, because it could be a very small thing that isn't included could completely stop the whole thing from working. So you need to be very precise with your vendor about what is actually being included. So the next thing is about where is it going to be delivered to. Now, this might also seem straightforward, but if you're talking about a large headquarters building, perhaps something to be delivered to the data center, you may find the address has something like 500 Oak Tree Avenue is the published address for the building. But you might find the goods in department has a totally different address because the goods in won't be at the front where the reception is, it'll be around the back or around the side in a different street. And so you need to find out what that actual address is. And in the UK and other places where the postcode system is very precise, you'll find there'll be an actual postcode for the goods in department, which you need to provide to the vendor. And that will uniquely identify a particular point. On Google Maps, you'll see where that particular postcode points to. So you need to be absolutely clear about where it's being delivered to. For a small site office, you might find there's no special goods in department at all. There's a front door and that's where it's going to be delivered to. But on larger sites it gets more complicated. And there is one site I know in London where the goods in department isn't actually even on the same block. It isn't round the back or round the side. It's in a totally different street. And there's a tunnel underneath that connects the site with the warehouse. So bear that in mind. The other thing on this point is also who is going to be the recipient of this delivery. There'll be an address on the delivery label, but there'll be a name. And the question is going to be what name you're going to use, because it won't be any good if it's your name if you're not based at that site. It really needs to be a name of somebody who is based at that site, who can handle the delivery, ideally. Ideally one of your team, but that may not be possible if you don't have any of your team members based at that site. So an alternative might be to use the name of a manager of one of the user community on that site, or possibly the manager's name for the goods in department. You'll need to check with them first, make sure they're happy, and you'll need to keep them up to date list so they know exactly what's going on and when. But if you have the name on the delivery label of somebody who isn't based in that site, you might find the delivery gets turned away. So you need to think about that as well. Next, I'm going to mention about actual appointment time at the goods in department or loading dock, because varying from place to place, I mean, a site that's got masses of space for trucks to arrive and leave, this isn't likely to be much of a problem. But if it's a small building or even a large building that's a headquarters, isn't expecting goods to arrive and leave, the goods in department is pretty much where stationery supplies arrive and where the rubbish lorries take the rubbish away from. So there won't be much space. You may need to arrange with the goods in manager for a specific date and time for the truck to arrive with your delivery. I'm thinking here particularly of larger deliveries that are going to come on a bigger truck. So don't think that it's just going to be okay for any time for the delivery to arrive. Check with the goods in manager, because you might find that they have a particular concern about choice of time and day and may want to book an appointment for that. Next thing to think about is how big and heavy is the delivery. We kind of covered this a little bit earlier with how many boxes, but really now I'm thinking about how big and heavy is this item. Because if we're talking about a server, anything really server size and above, you can't really expect one person to be able to handle it themselves. They're not going to be able to pick it up and carry it around. So there will need to be something with wheels on so it can be moved around. You may need two people in order to handle it to where it needs to go. So if you have those people and those wheels lined up in advance, it means the delivery is smooth as you want it to be. But if you haven't thought about this, it can become a bit of a problem. If people try and carry something that is too heavy for them, A, they may hurt themselves, and that's not going to do you any good. And secondly, they may drop the equipment and damage it. So you don't really want people taking those sort of risks. You know, the risks in the project, you don't want to add extra risks. So that's how big and heavy is it. The next is, how do you get the item, whatever it is, to where it's going to be needed or where it's going to be stored. Because if it's going to arrive before it can actually be received where it's needed, because they're laying tiles, so it can't be arrived right away. It needs to go from the goods into a storage location and then to the final location. So how are you going to move that around? And basically it comes to what I was saying a moment ago about wheels. Probably you need some sort of truck, some sort of, and when I say truck or skate, I mean a panel with wheels underneath that you put heavy things on, and it means you can move them around. The goods in department probably have these or have an idea of where they are. It might be the data center, that's where the equipment is going. They may have them. It's not necessarily a problem, but you will want it lined up, because otherwise you're just not going to be able to get the equipment away from the goods in department, and that won't be very good for you. So next I've got on my list is about multiple items. If you are expecting, for example, telephone sets to be delivered, the question is how you want those to be delivered. Now it might seem, if you've got a project to install telephones across a number of sites across the country or the state or the province or whatever, that just send the right amount to each location and it'll be fine. You might want to think carefully whether that's a good idea, because although that means that a vendor is actually doing the distribution for you, it means you've got multiple deliveries to think about, but you'll have that in any case. But with voice over IP hard phones, which I particularly know a bit more about, they take time to boot up, to configure and so on, and it might be easier to have all of those delivered to a lab or a staging site where it's convenient for you and your team to actually set them all up and then redispatch them from there to where they're actually going to be needed. So it doesn't follow that you want delivery to be where something is going to be used. If it's going to need some preparation, that is going to be available somewhere else. So just something to think about. And in fact, having deliveries of multiple items gets complicated anyway, but that's a question to think about. Should all these telephones, just an example, be delivered to the individual sites or to a central site where you're going to have your team configure them and then dispatch them ready to be used. So that's something to think about. And moving on to something that's fairly related is, what are the commissioning plans for whatever it is that's being delivered? Because if you're getting a piece of equipment delivered, like a server or something, it's going to be a piece of metal sitting in the data center doing nothing until it's commissioned. So do not be confused about a vendor saying, oh, such and such, the mail server is going to be delivered next Friday. And you think, oh, wonderful, it's going to be working on Monday morning. If you haven't, or the vendor hasn't arranged for an engineer to actually configure and set that machine up so it's ready for service, it won't be. So you need to make sure that with anything that's being delivered, you have in mind what's going to happen in terms of commissioning, so that you go from having a physical server on site with all the parts to having something that is functioning and ready for business. Right. Something else obviously to think about with deliveries is whether the package, when it arrives, has what you're expecting in it. We talked earlier on about details about what you're expecting. Once the package has arrived, you're going to need to check, or have one of your team check, is it actually containing everything that was expected? Does it have the leads that you checked that we would have? Do they have the connectors on the end that they needed to have? I mean, for example, with power leads, there are two different sorts of power lead in, I think, the US and the UK and probably Europe as well. So if it's come with a power lead, oh yeah, it's got the power leads, but it's got the wrong plugs on, that's not going to help you very much. And the other thing is whether the package is damaged. Now, if the box is visibly damaged, whoever receives it is going to turn it back to the carrier. But a lot of damage isn't visible till you open it up and actually check what's inside. If the box has been shaken up an awful lot, you may find that parts have come. There's all sorts of possible things that can happen. You want to make sure as soon as you can that the item that's been delivered has not been damaged and is as it is expected to be, because otherwise you are going to have trouble later on, obviously. Now here's an interesting one. If you're just ordering something from a vendor who's in the same city or the same state or the same country, then this next one isn't really going to affect you. But if anything has to come from another country, you have the whole issue of customs clearance between the two. Now, I've met this with one of my projects. I forget exactly where it was. I think it was an African country where the vendors thought they had stock of the server or whatever it is we needed, and they didn't. So the actual server had to come from a different country and it had to go through customs to get across the border. Now that's how it works. Across the EU, this isn't a problem because of course there's a common customs area. But if you are likely to have equipment come from a different country to the site in question, you've got that extra thing to track. And the carrier will give you advice and information as to, or the vendor will give you information as to what to expect with customs, and it'll be, depending on the terms and conditions, but it'll probably be their responsibility to get it through. This is also an interesting point where you are clear with the delivery about where the responsibility is for these things, because generally you want the vendor to be responsible for the item completely until the point it arrives on your or your client's premises. So in that case, getting it through customs is their responsibility. You would chase them, and it's them who would check with a carrier and deal with any issues. But you may need to think about customs if you're having equipment go across national borders. Now the next item is a bit of an odd one, and that's about whether the item is in stock. It comes from the last one, because the reason why you might have equipment come across borders and you weren't expecting it is because it isn't in stock in the country that you want it to be delivered to. But there is a question about whether something can be delivered because of whether it's actually in stock. So it's fine to check what's going to be delivered, when it's going to be delivered, where it's going to be delivered to. But if behind all of that, the vendor doesn't actually have stock of the item, well, the delivery isn't going to happen. Anyway, I'm going to move on now to some of the things to think about if delivery is early. Sometimes a vendor will ask to deliver something earlier than you need it, and that can be a good thing, but there's some things to think about. So first of all, if the item is going to be delivered early, what are you going to do with it after it arrives? Because it may be that it can go to the data center or wherever you're expecting it to be used, and it's not a problem. But if we're talking about several months early, then you may have to put into storage somewhere on site before you can actually put it to where it's going to be used. Then the question is, where are you going to store it? What are you going to do to make sure that it doesn't get lost or forgotten, so that when the time comes, you know where the item of equipment is and can get it to where it needs to be, and you can find it reliably. The next thing to think about is, if delivery has arrived early, who's going to actually check that the package contains what it needs to check, the package contains what it needs to, and all the parts, and it's not damaged. Because it may be that if the server is being delivered, say 2 months early, you don't have the team available at that point to do what they were going to do in 2 months' time. You may have planned the server gets delivered in 2 months' time, and by that time you'll have people ready to receive it, to work on it, etc. And if it's delivered 2 months early, you don't have that team. Somebody's got to check what that package actually contains and that it's not damaged, because otherwise what will happen is you will assume the server's arrived and it's all fine. 2 months will come along, and you'll start to want to use it, and you'll find then that it isn't what you thought it was, and you wouldn't want that situation to arise. So think about how you're going to check a delivery if it's early. Who's going to check it? Another thing to think about is that if the vendor is suggesting delivering it early, one of the reasons might be because they want payment early, and that may not seem much of a problem. If you have budget for your project, you'll have budget for this item so you can pay it early. But you probably have an arrangement with the finance department about how much you're going to be spending each month. And so if this particular unit of equipment, particularly if it's expensive, arrives 2 months early, the vendor's probably going to expect payment 2 months early. This may be one of the reasons why they want to get it on your site, because they want the money earlier. And you need to decide for yourself whether that's what you want. It may be that you don't. You may well decide to go to the vendor and say, I don't want it delivered 2 months early. I want it delivered on this date in the future, as we originally agreed. And as project manager, you need to decide how you want to play this. It's up to you. These are some of the things to think about, but it's up to you to consider what suits you. So bear that in mind, that payment will probably be required if it comes early, and you need to make sure that you can line up the ability to pay the invoice on time if that's what's required. One of the other things to think about if you are getting delivery early, and this is another reason why a vendor might want to deliver early, is what if the item in question becomes obsolete before the time you need it? Now, 2 months isn't going to make much of a difference, perhaps, but if they want to deliver something today that you don't expect till 6 months' time, when 6 months' time comes along, will the actual equipment that you're going to get delivery of going to be the most up-to-date? If it arrives today, it'll be the current version, ideally. Whereas 6 months' time, it might be a new version available then. Now, it's up to you and your technical people exactly which version you want and when and so on. But one of the catches with having delivery of something early is you've locked in which version you've got, and you've locked in what the equipment is. So if you later decide or find out that you actually needed a bigger server or a different server, if you've already taken delivery, it's complicated. And so you need to think about that carefully. And one other thing I'll just mention while we're talking about this is that if you're expecting the vendor to do any configuration work on the equipment before it comes to you, so they may be doing some configuring or configuration work on the system before it comes to you, that means technically that you've received delivery when they open the package on your behalf. So not when it actually comes to your site, but if they open it on your behalf, that is probably where that line is drawn, and that becomes something you have received in a sense. It also is a question about insurance, because normally you're responsible for the safety of something once it's arrived on your site. But if it's been counted as delivered when it's arrived on their site, there's a question about, well, what happens if somebody drops it? You know, whose cost is that? Is it yours or is it theirs? Who's insured against that? And the other thing is, if you find that the piece of equipment is no longer needed and they've already opened it, it means probably you're liable to pay for that equipment and for the professional time that they've applied to configuring it for you. You'll need to check the actual terms and conditions of the purchase and sale to see what your situation actually is. Now, the last point I'm going to make about early is it's generally a good thing to have something delivered early, because you know you've got it within bounds of reason, considering what I've just said. But if you've got it on your site, in front of you, with your people, you have one less thing to worry about. So generally, it's a good thing to have something arrive early. Conversely, obviously, if something arrives late, it's not a good thing, because it'll knock on to whatever is dependent on that particular piece of equipment. And that might seem obvious. And as I said before, even one little part of it missing can mean the whole unit is no use to you yet until that part arrives. But the thing to think about as a project manager isn't just that this unit being delivered late means that that happens late. It can completely snowball. You can find that a small, seemingly insignificant piece being late can snowball into the whole project being delayed, because this unit has a dependency here. I've got the words around the wrong way. This is dependent on that being delivered. This is dependent on that being delivered. And the effect can broaden out. So really keeping on track of equipment and deliveries and knowing exactly what is being delivered, exactly where, is really important to ensuring that a project remains on track, on budget, and to the necessary quality. So anyway, I hope you found that useful. Please respond to any comments you have in the comment section below, being respectful to other people's ideas, obviously, because it'd be interesting to see what other thoughts you have. There is, as I mentioned earlier, a written version of this article on my website, and you'll find the link to that below as well. Thank you for listening, and see you soon.